welcome back to Food Prep Guide. Today I want to talk to you about canning Headspace, this little area right here, and I want to talk about it from a safety versus a quality standpoint. When I first started learning how to can, one of the most frustrating things to me was that I very rarely found someone who would differentiate for me between what is a safety issue where it could breed bad bacteria that could harm my family, produce foodborne illness, versus what is simply a quality issue or a reproducibility issue. And what I mean by that is that the National Center for Home Food Preservation, their role is to streamline the canning process and produce recipes and guidelines that will produce repeatable, streamlined results for anyone who cans that recipe. So a lot of their guidelines are geared towards the quality, streamlining, repeatability side of recipes, and not all strictly about safety. Now, when I was first learning how to can, the National Center for Food Home Preservation was presented to me as the end-all be-all for safety. And in one way, I believe that's absolutely true, and I still kind of align myself with that. But like I said, some of it is just not about safety, it's just about quality. And as you're learning how to can and as you're learning how to make recipes, to me, in my brain, it was really important for me to differentiate between, okay, is this a safety issue or is it simply a quality issue? And of course, we want to produce the highest quality food possible when we're canning. We're not putting all that time in for nothing, but it is still nice to know what is a safety issue and what is simply quality issues. So let's talk about that today. So for anyone who's brand new to canning or watching this video for the first time thinking about getting into canning, what in the world is Headspace? Headspace is simply the amount of air or space between the top of your food and the top of the jar. That's all that means. And in canning, we fill our jars to different amounts of headspace. So let's first ask the question, why? Why do we fill them to different amounts? Different foods expand at different rates during the cooking process. So that's part of it. The second part of it is that certain food can settle more than others during the canning process. And so the guidelines for Headspace is about getting that happy medium that will leave as little air as possible, but still give us a good solid seal. What happens when you don't leave enough headspace is that you risk your food coming up and messing with the integrity of your seal, siphoning and just overfilling and leaking out, bubbling, leaking out during the canning process. The food inside the jars does come to a boil during the canning process, and so if you overfill your jars, you risk them leaking out, overflowing, and messing with the integrity of your seal. If you underfill your jars, let's say you've never canned before and you never looked up Headspace and you filled your jar to here, that leaves too much air in the jar, but it's not a safety issue, it's a quality issue. So let me finish my thought on there. I'm getting ahead of myself. If you leave too much space in the jar, it is too much air in the jar, and it's going to potentially decrease the quality of your finished product. If you still get a vacuum seal, the jar is still properly canned and it has a vacuum seal, but you just have unnecessary space, unnecessary air that just doesn't need to be there. Okay, so before we get into safety versus quality, let me very briefly talk about the different types of headspace. When you are first learning how to can, I highly recommend getting a tool like this. This is a debubble and measure tool in one. Debubble with this side, measure with this side. And you see the little stair steps. You put that on the end of your jar. Let me get an empty jar so I can put it. You put it on the end of the jar, and it tells you what the headspace is. And it's very hard to see on camera, but it's got 1 inch, 3/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch there. And as you're learning how to can, just take the guesswork out of it. You know, this is a tool that breeds familiarity and it breeds confidence. And you can just put it at the edge of your jar. You don't have to guess. You know exactly where the 1/4 inch headspace is. Now, I will admit that as you get more familiar with canning, I never use this to measure the headspace, because as you get more familiar with canning, you can see and use the parts that jut out. I don't know what they're called. The screw hole areas, things, I don't know. The ridges. You can use those as a visual guideline of where about the headspace is. So you see the neck of the jar, how it curves in right here. Right where it curves in, that's going to be your 1-inch headspace. 1-inch headspace is typically reserved for meats and vegetables. Almost all of your meats, almost all of your vegetables are going to be 1-inch headspace. And then we go up from there. 1/2-inch headspace, you see where this jutted out line right here, right above it, right above that jutted out line is going to be your 1/2-inch headspace. 1/2-inch headspace is reserved for things like salsa, relish, minced type of foods, certain vegetables. Did I say sauces? Okay, so the next one we go up to is 1/4-inch headspace. Now this one is a little bit tricky to eyeball because this jutted out line, it moves. So right here, it's almost all the way to the top. That's too close. But as you move the jar, it curves downward at an angle. But basically where right about here, that's going to be your 1/4-inch headspace. 1/4-inch headspace is reserved for fruits, jams, jellies, fruit butters, spreads, that kind of thing, that consistency. Also juices, fruit juices, things that are completely and totally liquid that don't have any grease to them. For instance, broth is liquid, but it's a greasy liquid. So we don't go to 1/4-inch headspace. We go down to 1-inch headspace, but something like grape juice, that's not greasy at all. And so we would go to a 1/4-inch headspace. So there's your kind of in general. Let me show you real life example. So this is a peach butter. We went up to 1/4-inch headspace right there, 1/4-inch headspace. Here is a Rotel? Yes, Rotel. And it is 1/2-inch headspace right above this jutted out line here. And then I'm going to be talking to you in detail about this in just a minute because you can see my water line is not 1-inch headspace, but you can see where the meat, the vast majority of the meat ends right below this line right here, right below that line right here, and that is 1-inch headspace. Now I will note that in recent years, the canning guidelines were updated to leave 1 1/4 inch headspace for meats. I think that's probably just because of seal rate failures with greasy foods. I still just kind of fall within the 1-inch to 1 1/4 inch headspace. Okay, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty of safety versus quality. The reason why I thought about doing this video is because we have had questions before from people who say that they canned up a jar of salsa of Rotel and they realized after the fact, like when they were pulling it out of the canner or when they saw it on the counter while it was cooling, they realized they didn't get their headspace right. And I have had people email in saying, are my jars ruined because I didn't get the headspace right? And no, this is not a ruined jar issue. This is not a bacteria is going to spontaneously combust and start reproducing in this jar because I didn't get the headspace right. That is not the case at all. And that is one of the issues that I had with learning how to can is I couldn't find anyone to tell me that, to differentiate for me why the rule was the way it was, and you know, is it a safety issue or is it just a quality issue? So if you are canning and you realize after the fact that you got your headspace off a little bit, it's not a big deal. Do not throw away your food just because of that. That is not a safety issue. When we talk about quality, I mentioned that we obviously want the highest quality possible, so I am not in the habit of skimping on quality. That would be silly. But at the same time, I know that if my jar comes out of the canner and it is way below the proper headspace amount, I am confident, absolute confidence, that this jar is totally fine. So let me use this jar an example of quality. If you can see the liquid line is right here. Everything above the liquid line is exposed to air. Obviously, it's not submerged under liquid. I've got a fuzzy bothering me. Go. It's not submerged under liquid. So what happens is that food is going to potentially discolor over time. Discoloring in this particular instance with a headspace being above the liquid line is not a safety issue. It is a quality issue. Yes, we want our food to look beautiful. We want it to stay in peak, pristine, beautiful condition. It's not nice for the meat above the liquid line to turn a dark brown or even a teeny tinge of like a grayish color. But it doesn't mean that the food is spoiling. That's not a sign that the food is spoiling. It is simply above the liquid line and exposed to air. So that's what I mean by quality. This might sit on my shelf for a year, and when I go to grab it, this meat above the liquid line might have a slightly gray tinge to it. I'm fine with that. I know that that is not a safety issue. It is a quality issue. Now, when it comes to determining, this isn't a video dedicated to determining whether or not your canned food has gone bad. We do have a video on that, and I will link it below, the top 8 signs that you need to know that if your canning food has gone bad. And changing colors is one of those signs, but that's when we're talking about mold. We're talking about pinks and greens and fuzzy grays, not simply just a tint of the meat going a darker tint, if that makes sense. So I just wanted to mention that. Another thing that I wanted to mention about Headspace, when you are canning bone-in meat, do you see those 2 bones right there? When you are canning in bone-in meat, it is very hard to get everything at the same level because the bones stick out. Another example of this would be raw packing green beans. When you're raw packing green beans, you can cut them, of course, to all the same level, and so there's some streamlining to that. But most of the time you're going to have 1 or 2 little twigs of green beans sticking up higher than the water line. The same thing goes for pickles, asparagus, things like that. You're going to have a couple that stick above, way above the recommended headspace. So the recommended headspace for meat is, like I said, 1 inch to 1 1/4 inch, which is right here. Well, as soon as I loaded these jars, those bones stuck up all the way almost to a 1/4 inch headspace. Is that a problem? And the answer is no, because the vast majority of the meat is down here in the 1 inch headspace. Because remember, headspace is not a safety issue in the sense of if I don't get it just right, it could start producing bacteria. That's not the case. It's simply a quality issue. So those sticking up to 1/4 inch headspace is not a problem because the vast majority of the meat is down here, which means even if I do have a little bit of siphoning and the water level goes up and a little bit goes out, it's still not going to affect my seal and make it to where it doesn't seal at all. It's still pushing the air out. I'm still getting a vacuum seal, and this jar is fine, even though there's a few little twigs, not twigs, you know what I mean? But they're still sticking up into that headspace line. So I wanted to mention that. Let me check my notes here. Yeah, the bone-in meats, okay. So I just wanted to wrap up with reviewing that headspace is not a botulism factor. Headspace is getting the amount of space proper inside the jar between the food and the rim to prevent overflowing and to prevent way too much air. And even if there is way too much air, that's not going to cause your food to spontaneously start producing bacteria and multiplying and getting into a dangerous state. It's simply that your food might discolor over time because there's more space in there, if that makes sense. Okay, I think that is it. If you are brand new to canning, highly recommend one of these tools. Also, if you feel like you want some more support or need more support in your canning journey, we do have an online self-paced canning one-on-one masterclass. Go ahead and comment canning class down in the comments below, and I'll send you that link if you're interested so you don't have to go fishing for it in the comments section. Okay, hope that was helpful, and that's all for today. We'll see you next time. Bye.